The church fell silent when she walked down the aisle. Not the kind of silence that comes from awe, but the kind that cuts like broken glass. 300 guests turned in their pews, and not one of them could hide their shock. The bride was beautiful, yes, but she was also heavy, much heavier than anyone had expected. And in that small Texas town, where everyone knew everyone else's business, expectations mattered more than truth. Sarah Miller took each step carefully, her white satin dress flowing around her like a dream she had almost given up on. She had spent months finding the perfect dress, one that made her feel like the princess she had never thought she could be. The bodice was carefully fitted, the sleeves delicate lace that caught the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant bun, her makeup flawless, her smile radiant with the kind of joy that comes from finding love when you least expect it. She was, in every sense of the word, a beautiful bride. But the 300 people packed into St. Mary's Church weren't seeing her beauty. They were seeing her size. They were calculating the difference between what they had imagined Jake's bride would look like and what they were actually seeing. And the whispers had already begun. At the altar stood Jake Morrison, tall and rugged in his black tuxedo, his calloused hands clasped in front of him as he watched the woman he loved walk toward him. His weathered face, marked by years of working cattle under the Texas sun, broke into a smile that reached his eyes. To Jake, Sarah was perfect. She was the kindness that had healed his broken heart after his first wife died. She was the laughter that had filled his empty house. She was the gentle soul who had loved his daughter like her own from the very first day they met. In the front pew sat 5-year-old Emma Morrison, Jake's daughter, wearing a pink dress with white flowers and white patent leather shoes that she had picked out herself. Her blonde hair was braided with tiny white ribbons, and she clutched a small bouquet of daisies in her lap. Her bright blue eyes were fixed on Sarah, and her face glowed with pure excitement. To Emma, this was the best day of her entire life. The day her almost mommy would finally become her real mommy. Emma had been counting down the days to this wedding for months. She had helped Sarah pick out the flowers, had practiced walking down the aisle in her flower girl dress, and had even given Sarah advice about how to do her hair. "Daddy likes it when you wear it down," she had whispered conspiratorially. "But I think up is prettier for a wedding." Emma saw Sarah the way children see the adults they love, with eyes unclouded by judgment or expectation. To her, Sarah was simply the most wonderful woman in the world. But as Sarah continued her slow walk down the aisle, the atmosphere in the church began to shift. The initial shocked silence gave way to something worse. Whispers began to ripple through the congregation like stones thrown into still water. The sound was soft at first, barely audible over the organ music, but it grew louder and more cruel with each passing second. "My goodness, look at the size of her," whispered Mrs. Henderson from the third row, leaning toward her neighbor. "That poor man. What was he thinking?" "That dress is really working overtime," muttered someone else, not bothering to lower their voice as much as they should have. "I heard she works at that diner downtown," said another voice. "You know the type. Probably thinks she hit the jackpot landing a rancher like Jake." The cruel comments spread through the church like wildfire. Some people tried to hide their shock behind polite smiles, but their eyes betrayed them. Others weren't even trying to be subtle. They turned to their neighbors with raised eyebrows and knowing looks, as if Sarah's appearance was somehow a personal affront to them. Sarah heard every word. How could she not? The church acoustics carried every whisper, every gasp, every cruel observation straight to her ears. Her steps began to falter slightly, and for just a moment, the radiant smile wavered on her face. Her hands trembled as she gripped her bouquet tighter, the white roses and baby's breath suddenly feeling as heavy as stones. She had known this might happen. She had prepared herself for it, or at least she thought she had. But the reality of 300 people staring at her, judging her, finding her lacking, was more brutal than she had imagined. Her chest tightened, and she fought back the tears that threatened to spill down her carefully made-up cheeks. Jake saw the change in her immediately. His jaw clenched as he caught fragments of the whispers, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He wanted to shout at them all, to tell them they were missing the point entirely. They were seeing her body, but they weren't seeing her heart. They weren't seeing the woman who stayed up all night when Emma had the flu, who learned to braid hair from YouTube videos, who sang lullabies in a voice like honey. They weren't seeing the woman who had brought light back into his dark world. Emma, still clutching her daisies, began to sense that something was wrong. The happy murmur she had expected from the crowd wasn't there. Instead, there were these strange, hushed voices that sounded angry and mean. She turned slightly in her pew to look at the faces behind her, her 5-year-old mind trying to understand why people looked upset instead of happy. This was supposed to be a celebration, wasn't it? This was supposed to be the day everyone celebrated her new family. The whispers grew louder, more bold. Someone actually laughed, a sound that cut through the sacred space like a blade. Sarah's steps slowed even more, and Jay could see her fighting an internal battle between moving forward toward their future and turning around to flee from the cruelty. And then, just as it seemed she might gather her skirts and run back down that aisle, something happened that would change everything. Something that would turn this moment of shame into something beautiful. Something that would remind everyone in that church what real beauty actually looks like. But first, the whispers had to reach their peak. The cruelty had to show its true face, and a 5-year-old girl had to decide she had heard enough. The whispers that had begun as shocked murmurs now grew into something far more sinister. Sarah could hear them despite the organ music that was supposed to mask the congregation's reactions. Each step down the aisle felt heavier than the last, weighed down not by her dress, but by the cruel words floating through the sanctuary like poison. "Did you see the size of her?" "Poor Jake," came a voice from the third row, barely concealed behind a cupped hand. "That dress is working overtime," snickered another guest, followed by muffled laughter that cut through Sarah's heart like glass. "How embarrassing for that little girl," whispered an elderly woman, shaking her head with theatrical pity. "Having that as a stepmother." The comments grew bolder, crueler, as if the guests had forgotten they were in a house of worship. Sarah's carefully applied makeup began to run as tears she'd fought so hard to contain finally broke free. Her bouquet trembled in her hands. White roses and baby's breath that had seemed so perfect that morning, now feeling like props in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Jake stood at the altar, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. His hands were balled into fists at his sides, the knuckles white with restraint. He could hear every word, see every smirk, feel every judgmental stare directed at the woman he loved more than life itself. The urge to turn around and tell the entire congregation exactly what he thought of their cruelty battled with his desire to protect Sarah from even more humiliation. "Maybe we should just call this off," he heard someone behind him suggest in a stage whisper. "Save them both the embarrassment." Sarah's steps faltered. She was only halfway down the aisle, but it felt like she'd walked a mile through enemy territory. Her eyes found Jake's, and she saw the pain there, not for himself, but for her. The love was still there, burning bright and true, but it was surrounded by a fury that scared her. Not because she feared Jake would hurt anyone, but because she feared what this moment was doing to all of them. Her gaze shifted to little Emma, standing beside the altar in her flower girl dress of soft pink tulle, clutching her basket of rose petals with both hands. The 5-year-old's eyes were wide, darting back and forth between the adults around her, clearly sensing that something was very wrong, even if she couldn't understand what. Sarah's resolve crumbled. She couldn't put this innocent child through any more of this spectacle. She couldn't ask Jake to defend her against his entire community. And she certainly couldn't endure another step toward that altar while 300 people discussed her body, her worth, her right to happiness, as if she were some sort of carnival attraction. She began to turn, ready to lift her dress and run back down that aisle, out of the church, out of town if necessary. The humiliation would be complete, but at least it would be over. At least Emma wouldn't have to witness any more of this cruelty directed at the woman she'd grown to love as a mother. But just as Sarah's foot pivoted toward escape, a clear, strong voice rang out through the sanctuary. It cut through the whispers, the barely contained laughter, the cruel commentary, with the pure power of absolute truth. "She's beautiful, Daddy." The church fell into the kind of silence that only comes when something sacred has just been spoken. Every head turned toward the altar where Emma stood, no longer clutching her flower basket, but letting it rest at her feet as she looked directly at her father with the unwavering confidence that only children possess. "She's beautiful, Daddy," Emma repeated, her voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary. "The most beautiful lady I ever seen." Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. The tears that had been falling from shame now fell from something else entirely. A gratitude so deep it felt like drowning and being saved at the same time. Emma wasn't finished. She took a small step forward, her patent leather shoes clicking against the marble floor, and her voice grew even stronger. "Why are all these people being mean? Don't they see how pretty she is?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with innocence and impossible to ignore. Faces that had been twisted with judgment and amusement now showed the first cracks of shame. Several guests looked down at their hands, suddenly unable to meet the eyes of the child who had just held up a mirror to their cruelty. But Emma still wasn't finished. What came next would be seared into the memory of everyone present for the rest of their lives. Her voice, still clear and strong, carried a truth so profound that it would change not just this moment, but every heart in that sanctuary. Sarah stood frozen in the aisle, tears streaming down her face, no longer caring about her makeup or the whispers or anything except the little girl who had just seen her, really, truly seen her, in a way that 300 adults had failed to do. But Emma wasn't finished. What she said next would bring the entire church to tears. Emma took another step forward, her small voice growing stronger with each word, as if she was drawing power from some deep well of truth that adults have forgotten how to access. The entire congregation leaned forward, hanging on every syllable from this 5-year-old who had just shattered their comfortable cruelty with 3 simple words. "Don't they see how happy she makes you, Daddy?" Emma's voice carried a wisdom far beyond her years. She looked directly at Jake, then turned her gaze to encompass the entire congregation. "Don't they see how she loves me like a real mommy?" Sarah's hand flew to her heart, the words hitting her with the force of a revelation. In all her worry about not being thin enough, pretty enough, good enough for this family, she had forgotten the most important truth of all. She was already part of this family, had been from the moment Emma first crawled into her lap at the diner 6 months ago. But Emma wasn't done sharing her truth with these adults who had somehow forgotten how to see what really mattered. "She reads me stories every night," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each declaration. "She makes my lunch with the crust cut off just how I like it. She braids my hair pretty for school and puts little ribbons in it." With each word, Emma took another small step forward, commanding the attention of every single person in that sanctuary. Her flower girl dress rustled softly as she moved, the pink tulle catching the light from the stained glass windows like she was surrounded by her own personal rainbow. "She holds me when I have bad dreams about Mommy being gone." Emma's voice carried across the silent church like a prayer. "She sings me songs and makes funny voices when she reads. She teaches me to bake cookies and lets me lick the spoon. She comes to my school plays and cheers so loud that everyone knows she loves me." The congregation sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Henderson in the 4th row felt her cheeks burn with shame as she remembered her earlier comment about embarrassment. How could she have said such cruel things about a woman who was clearly devoted to this little girl? Mr. Peterson, who had made the crack about the dress, working overtime, found himself thinking about his own wife. how she'd struggled with her weight after their children were born, how he'd loved her just the same because love sees the heart, not the scale. "She's the best mommy in the whole world," Emma declared, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. "And she's beautiful. She's beautiful inside where it matters. And she's beautiful outside too, because she's full of love." Emma turned to face Sarah directly, her small face glowing with pure adoration. "You are beautiful, Mommy Sarah. You're the most beautiful mommy, and I don't understand why these grown-ups can't see it." The word mommy hit the congregation like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just about defending someone's appearance. This was a daughter defending her mother, a child protecting the woman who had chosen to love her unconditionally despite having no biological obligation to do so. Sarah couldn't hold back her sobs any longer. 6 months of insecurity, weeks of dreading this day, years of feeling not good enough, all of it dissolved in the face of this little girl's fierce, protective love. She pressed her bouquet to her chest and let the tears flow freely, no longer caring about her makeup or what anyone thought. The transformation in the sanctuary was visible, like watching ice melt in the spring sun. Face after face showed the dawning recognition of their own cruelty. Mrs. Jameson, who had whispered about Sarah's size, was thinking about her own daughter who struggled with self-image. How would she feel if someone talked about her child that way? Young Timothy Miller, barely 18 and full of the thoughtless cruelty of youth, was remembering his own stepfather who had loved him like a biological son, who had never made him feel less than whole. How could he have mocked someone who was doing the exact same thing for Emma? One by one, people began to cry. Not the quiet, polite tears of a wedding ceremony, but deep, soul-searching tears of recognition and shame. They were seeing themselves clearly for the first time, and what they saw wasn't pretty. Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, overwhelmed with pride for his daughter and love for the woman she was defending. Emma had done what he couldn't. She had made them all see Sarah the way he saw her, the way love sees, the way a child sees before the world teaches them to judge. The elderly minister, Reverend Matthews, stepped forward, his own eyes glistening with tears. He had officiated hundreds of weddings in his 40 years of service, but he had never witnessed anything like this. The Holy Spirit was moving in this place, speaking truth through the mouth of a child, just as Scripture promised. "Out of the mouth of babes," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the sacred silence. "Children see with the eyes of heaven, unclouded by the world's false judgments." This little girl has reminded us all what true beauty looks like. It looks like love in action, sacrifice, devotion, and the choice to see others as God sees them. Emma beamed at the minister's words, sensing approval even if she didn't understand all the big words. She had done what felt right in her heart, defended someone she loved, spoken truth the way children do, simply, directly, and without fear of consequences. Sarah took a shuddering breath and resumed her walk down the aisle, but everything had changed. The same people who had whispered cruel words now watched with respect, admiration, and growing shame for their earlier behavior. Some reached out to touch her dress as she passed, a gesture of apology and blessing. Jake met her eyes and smiled through his tears, extending his hand to help her up the final step to the altar. "She's right," he whispered, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "You are the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." But how did this unlikely family come to be? And why did their love story face such opposition from the very beginning? 6 months earlier, Jake Matthews had walked into Rosie's diner with his 4-year-old daughter Emma clinging to his hand, both of them still adjusting to their new reality. It had been 8 months since Emma's mother died in a car accident, 8 months of Jake trying to figure out how to be both father and mother to a little girl who kept asking when mommy was coming home. The diner was busy that Tuesday morning, filled with the usual crowd of farmers grabbing coffee before heading to their fields and office workers stealing a few extra minutes before facing their day. Jake had chosen a corner booth, hoping to avoid the pitying looks that seemed to follow him everywhere since Rebecca's death. Emma sat across from him, swinging her legs and coloring on the paper placemat with crayons the previous waitress had brought over. That's when Sarah appeared at their table, notepad in hand, and the warmest smile Jake had seen in months. She wasn't like the other waitresses at Rosie's. Younger, thinner women who flirted with the single men and barely acknowledged the children. Sarah was different. She was soft around the edges in a way that suggested comfort rather than fashion, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "What can I get you folks this morning?" she asked, but her attention immediately went to Emma. "And what's this beautiful artwork you're creating, sweetheart?" Emma looked up shyly. She'd become withdrawn since her mother's death, speaking mainly to Jake and only when necessary. But something about Sarah's genuine interest made her perk up. "It's a rainbow," Emma whispered, holding up her placemat. "Mommy used to say rainbows come after storms." Sarah's expression softened with understanding, not pity. "Your mommy was absolutely right. And this is the most beautiful rainbow I've ever seen. You know what? I bet a rainbow artist like you would love our rainbow pancakes. They have all different colored sprinkles." Emma's eyes lit up for the first time in weeks. "Really? Rainbow pancakes?" Jake watched in amazement as this stranger coaxed his daughter out of her shell with nothing more than genuine kindness and attention. When Sarah returned with Emma's rainbow pancakes, she had also brought a small cup of extra sprinkles in case the rainbow needed to be brighter. But it was what happened next that changed everything. Emma, excited about her special pancakes, reached for her chocolate milk a little too enthusiastically. The glass tipped, sending chocolate milk cascading across the table, on her dress, and dripping steadily onto the floor. Emma's face crumpled, and she began to cry. Not just from a mess, but from the overwhelming emotions of a little girl who felt like everything she touched turned into disaster. Jake started to get up, grabbing napkins and preparing to clean up the mess while soothing his daughter, but Sarah was already there. She didn't rush or make a big production of it. She simply knelt beside Emma's chair, gently wiping the little girl's tears before addressing the spill. "Oh, honey, accidents happen," Sarah said softly, cleaning Emma's dress with gentle pats rather than harsh rubbing. "You know what? This gives us a chance to make today even more special. What do you say we get you a fresh chocolate milk? And I'll bring some extra whipped cream for those rainbow pancakes." "Whipped cream makes everything better." Emma nodded through her sniffles, and Sarah continued cleaning the mess without any sign of annoyance or hurry, even though Jake could see other tables needed attention. She treated Emma like she was the most important person in the diner, taking time to make sure she felt better before moving on. "There we go. Good as new," Sarah said, standing up with the damp towels. "I'll be right back with that fresh milk and extra whipped cream." As she walked away, Jake realized he was staring, not at her appearance, though he found her genuinely beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with magazine covers or movie screens. He was staring because he had just witnessed something extraordinary, a stranger treating his daughter with the kind of tender care he thought only family could provide. That was the beginning. Jake started coming to the diner every Tuesday, then Tuesdays and Fridays, then whenever he could find an excuse. Emma always asked for the nice lady with the smile, and Sarah always remembered exactly how Emma liked her pancakes, exactly which crayons were her favorites, exactly how to make a shy little girl feel special. Slowly, carefully, Jake and Sarah began to build something together. Coffee conversations while Emma napped in the booth became longer talks during Sarah's break. Jake learned that Sarah had never married, never had children of her own, but had always dreamed of being a mother. Sarah learned about Jake's struggle to raise Emma alone, his fears that he wasn't enough, his desperate wish that his daughter could have a mother's love again. The first time Jake asked Sarah to dinner, a real date, not just coffee at the diner, she said yes so quickly it surprised them both. The first time Emma fell asleep between them on Jake's couch during a movie, Sarah's hand found Jake's over Emma's sleeping form. and he knew he was falling in love with both the woman and the way she loved his daughter. Within 3 months, Sarah was spending weekends at Jake's house. She learned Emma's bedtime routine, her favorite songs, the exact way she liked her hair braided for school. Emma, starved for maternal affection, soaked up Sarah's attention like a flower in the desert. She started calling her almost mommy, a title that made Sarah cry happy tears every single time. But not everyone in their small town of Millbrook was happy about the relationship. "That poor man could do so much better," whispered the ladies at the grocery store, not caring who heard them. "A handsome rancher like Jake Matthews, he could have his pick of women. Why would he settle for the heavy girl from the diner?" "It's not fair to that little girl," added others. "She needs a proper stepmother, someone who looks the part. What's she going to think when she gets older and realizes her father could have done better?" The comments found their way back to Sarah, as cruel comments always do in small towns. She began to doubt herself, to question whether she was being selfish by accepting Jake's love when the whole town thought he deserved better. She started declining invitations to community events, avoiding places where she might run into groups of people who would judge Jake's choice. Jake noticed Sarah's growing insecurity and tried to combat it with reassurance and love, but the town's judgment was persistent and cruel. When he proposed on Emma's 5th birthday, with Emma's enthusiastic approval and help in picking out the ring, the engagement announcement in the local paper generated more gossip than congratulations. "Maybe we should just have a small ceremony," Sarah suggested one evening as they planned their wedding. "Just us, Emma, and the minister. We don't need a big production." But Emma had other ideas. "I want a princess wedding," she declared. "I want to wear a pretty dress and throw flowers and see you in a beautiful white dress like a fairy tale." Sarah looked at Jake helplessly. How could they explain to a 5-year-old that they wanted to avoid a big wedding because people would be cruel about her almost mommy? How could they tell her that sometimes love wasn't enough to overcome a small town's judgment? "She deserves her princess wedding," Jake said firmly. "And you deserve to walk down that aisle in front of everyone who matters to us. Let them talk." Emma sees the truth, and that's all that matters. Despite the town's judgment, they chose love. But the wedding day would test that choice in ways none of them expected. The transformation that began with Emma's words spread through the congregation like ripples in a pond. What had started as a moment of shame was becoming something far more powerful, a genuine awakening of hearts that had forgotten how to see with compassion. Mrs. Henderson was the first to move. The elderly woman who had whispered about embarrassment slowly stood from her pew, her arthritic hands gripping the wooden bench for support. With tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, she made her way to the aisle where Sarah still stood, bouquet trembling in her hands. "Sarah, honey," Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked with emotion. "I'm so deeply sorry. I forgot what really matters. That little girl, she sees what I should have seen all along." She reached out with shaking hands to touch Sarah's arm. "You are beautiful, dear. Beautiful in all the ways that count." Her apology seemed to break a dam. One by one, others began to rise from their seats. Mr. Peterson, who had made the cruel comment about Sarah's dress, approached with his hat in his hands like a penitent schoolboy. "Ma'am, I need to ask your forgiveness," he stammered, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. "What I said was unforgivable. My own wife struggled with her weight after our babies were born, and I loved her more each day because of the kind of mother she was. I should have seen that in you." His voice broke. "That little girl sees what real love looks like, and I was too blind and cruel to see it." The apologies came in waves now. Young couples who had snickered approached with red faces and genuine remorse. Parents who had whispered cruel things thought about their own children and how they would feel if someone spoke about them that way. The congregation was experiencing a collective moment of moral clarity, seeing their behavior through the eyes of an innocent child who loved without condition. Sarah found herself embracing people she had feared, accepting apologies from voices that had wounded her just minutes before. Each, "I'm sorry," seemed to heal a piece of her heart that had been broken by months of whispered judgments and cruel looks. "I was jealous," admitted Janet Phillips, a woman in her 30s who had always prided herself on her appearance. "Jealous of how happy Jake looked with you, how much that little girl adored you. I've been married 5 years, and my husband never looks at me the way Jake looks at you. I was cruel because I was envious of the love you have." Tom Bradley, a burly farmer who had made several cutting remarks, stood before Sarah with tears in his eyes. "My daughter is Emma's age," he said quietly. "If someone spoke about my wife the way I spoke about you today, I want to knock their teeth out. That little girl defended you better than I've ever defended my own family. I'm ashamed and I'm sorry." Reverend Matthews watched the scene unfold with wonder. In 40 years of ministry, he had never witnessed such a profound moment of community repentance. The Holy Spirit was moving through this sanctuary, using the pure heart of a child to convict and transform adult hearts that had grown callous with judgment. "Perhaps," the minister said gently, his voice carrying over the emotional conversations, "we should continue with this sacred ceremony. Love has already won today, and I believe we all want to witness the blessing of this beautiful union." Jake took Sarah's hand as she finally reached the altar, both of them overwhelmed by what had just transpired. Emma beamed up at them, completely unaware that she had just orchestrated one of the most powerful moments of grace any of them would ever witness. The vows that followed carried a deeper meaning than anyone had expected. When Jake promised to love Sarah for better or worse, in sickness and health, the congregation understood that this couple had already weathered the worst and emerged stronger. When Sarah promised to love not just Jake, but to be a loving mother to Emma, there wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary. Emma's role as flower girl became a celebration rather than a duty. As she scattered rose petals down the aisle after the ceremony, people reached out to touch her hand, to thank her, to tell her how proud they were of her courage. She giggled and danced, delighted by all the attention, but still not fully understanding the magnitude of what she had done. The recessional was unlike any wedding march the old church had ever witnessed. Instead of polite applause, there was genuine celebration. People cheered, some still crying, all of them transformed by witnessing love triumph over judgment. The reception at the community hall was a complete transformation from what anyone had expected. The same people who had whispered cruel words hours before were now celebrating with genuine joy. The music was louder, the laughter more heartfelt, the dancing more energetic because everyone felt lighter, cleaner, forgiven, and forgiving. Sarah, who had dreaded this public celebration, found herself glowing with confidence. She danced with Jake, with Emma, and even with some of the men who had apologized, all of them eager to show their respect and genuine happiness for the couple. The toasts were particularly moving. Mr. Peterson stood up, still emotional, and raised his glass. "To Emma Matthews, the wisest person in this room, who taught us all that real beauty comes from love. And to Sarah, who proves every day that the best mothers are the ones who choose to love." Mrs. Henderson followed with her own toast, "To the power of seeing with our hearts instead of our eyes, and to the reminder that sometimes the most important lessons come from the smallest teachers." Emma sat at the head table in her pink dress, swinging her legs and beaming as the adults around her celebrated not just a wedding, but a transformation of an entire community's heart. She had no idea that her simple, honest words had changed the trajectory of every life in that room. As the evening progressed, people kept approaching the family to share stories of their own struggles with judgment, their own moments of cruelty they regretted, their own hopes to do better. The wedding reception had become a community healing service, all because one little girl had chosen to speak truth with love. Sarah danced with more confidence than she had ever felt in her life, radiant not just because of the love surrounding her, but because she had finally seen herself through the eyes of love rather than the eyes of judgment. The woman who had nearly fled the altar in shame was now celebrating in joy, surrounded by a community that had been transformed by witnessing the power of a child's pure heart. But did this transformation last? Or would the town slip back into old habits once the wedding emotions faded? 1 year later, the Matthews family stood in their kitchen on a Saturday morning, sunlight streaming through gingham curtains as Emma helped Sarah flip pancakes. The transformation that had begun in a church sanctuary had rippled outward in ways none of them could have imagined, changing not just their lives, but the very heart of their community. Sarah moved with a confidence that would have seemed impossible that terrifying wedding day. Her laughter filled the kitchen as Emma insisted on making rainbow pancakes, just like the one from their first meeting at Rosie's Diner. The woman who had once hidden from community events was now the unofficial coordinator of the town's monthly newcomer welcome dinners, helping other families feel accepted in ways she had once only dreamed of experiencing herself. Mommy Sarah, Emma called out, now 6 years old and even more wise than before. Mrs. Johnson is coming to lunch today, and she's nervous about the church potluck tomorrow. Can you tell her what you told Mrs. Garcia? Jake smiled from his seat at the kitchen table, watching his wife and daughter work together with a natural rhythm of two people who belong together. Sarah had officially adopted Emma 6 months after the wedding, but everyone agreed the papers had simply made legal what had been true from the moment a little girl first called her almost mommy. The story of Emma's wedding day speech had spread far beyond the borders of Millbrook. Someone had recorded the ceremony on their phone, and within weeks, the video had found its way to social media. 5-year-old defends her stepmother against wedding guests had been viewed millions of times, shared by parents, teachers, and anyone who needed a reminder about what really matters in life. News outlets had picked up the story, requesting interviews, but the family had chosen to remain private, letting their actions speak louder than any media appearance ever could. Sarah had started a support group for women struggling with self-image and societal judgment, meeting every Tuesday at the community center. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the woman the town had once judged was now helping others overcome the very same struggles. You know what I learned from that day? Sarah would tell the women in her group. A child taught me that love sees what the world misses. Emma didn't see my size, my flaws, my insecurities. She saw my heart, my actions, my love for her family. When we start seeing ourselves through the eyes of love instead of the eyes of judgment, everything changes. The impact on Emma had been profound as well. Now 6 years old, she had become something of a local celebrity. But more importantly, she had become an advocate for kindness in ways that amazed the adults around her. Her first-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, often shared stories about Emma's wisdom with other educators. Last week, a new student was being teased for wearing glasses. Mrs. Patterson told the principal. Emma stood up and said, "Those glasses help him see better, just like my words help people see better at Mommy Sarah's wedding." Being different isn't bad, it's special. The other children immediately stopped teasing and started including him. Emma's philosophy had crystallized into what she called seeing with your heart eyes. When adults complimented her on her wisdom, she would simply shrug and say, "Beauty isn't what you look like. Beauty is what you do with your heart." The phrase had become something of a town motto. Local businesses displayed signs with Emma's words. The high school guidance counselor used it in anti-bullying presentations. Parents taught it to their children as naturally as they taught them to say please and thank you. The transformation of Millbrook itself had been remarkable. The town that had once been known for its gossip and judgment had become a place where newcomers felt welcomed, where differences were celebrated, where children learned early that kindness mattered more than appearances. Real estate agents actually used the story as a selling point. Come to Millbrook, where a little girl taught an entire community to see with their hearts. Mrs. Henderson, now 78, had become one of Sarah's closest friends and staunchest supporters. The woman who had whispered cruel words on wedding day now proudly introduced Sarah as the daughter I never had and told anyone who would listen about Emma's wisdom. "That child changed my heart," she would say. "At my age, I thought I was set in my ways, but Emma showed me I still had growing to do." I spent 77 years judging books by their covers until a 6-year-old taught me to read with my heart. The annual celebration of Jake and Sarah's wedding anniversary had become a community-wide event, not because people wanted to remember their own shame, but because they wanted to celebrate the moment their town learned to love better. They called it Hard Eyes Day, and children would wear special glasses with hearts drawn on them to remind everyone to see with love. The ripple effects continue to spread. Teachers in neighboring towns began using Emma's story in their classrooms. Pastors shared it in sermons about judgment and grace. Parents told it to their children as a bedtime story about courage and truth. Marriage counselors used it to help couples remember what really mattered in love. On this particular Saturday morning, as Sarah finished the pancakes and Jake read the newspaper, Emma looked up from her coloring book with the expression that usually preceded one of her profound observations. "Mommy Sarah," she said thoughtfully, "I'm glad I said those words at your wedding, but I'm more glad that people listen with their hard ears." Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, still amazed by this little girl who had changed her life in ways both small and monumental. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Well," Emma explained with the patient tone of someone much older, "lots of people say mean things, but not everybody stops to listen when someone tells them love is better. Our town is special because they decided to listen." Jake put down his newspaper and joined his wife and daughter, wrapping them both in a bear hug that had become their Saturday morning tradition. "You're right, Emma. We're all lucky that people chose to let love change their hearts." Later that afternoon, the family attended another wedding at the same church where their own transformation had begun. As they sat in the familiar wooden pews, Emma watched the bride walk down the aisle. A nervous young woman who was clearly pregnant and facing her own whispers from some of the guests. Emma tugged on Sarah's dress and whispered just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "She's beautiful too, right, Mommy Sarah? All brides are beautiful because they're happy and full of love." The whispers that had started to spread through the congregation stopped immediately. People smiled instead, remembering the lesson they had learned a year ago from this same wise little girl. The pregnant bride walked down the aisle to supportive smiles and genuine joy, never knowing that she had been saved from cruelty by the memory of a child's brave words. And that's how a 5-year-old girl changed not just a wedding day, but an entire community's heart. Sometimes the most profound truths come from the smallest voices. Sometimes it takes a child to remind adults how to love without conditions, how to see beauty in character rather than appearance, how to choose kindness over judgment.